So today we're going to be talking about the five senses, but specifically in fantasy. You probably have heard the phrase show don't tell. In case you haven't, I'll give a quick recap, and this is also for the video. Showing is when you show something through action in writing instead of telling. So telling is she has blonde hair, whereas showing would be she flipped her blonde hair in disgust or something. As a result, that is giving attaching an action to the detail, so this helps make it so it's far more interesting. So having show not tell is great. The only problem comes when you're writing fantasy, right? You're talking about a whole bunch of things that you probably never have experienced and probably, unfortunately, never will experience. And I know that some of you this will not apply, but when I say in fantasy, I'm going to be talking mainly about fantasy, but I'm also going to be talking about how to write things that you've never experienced before. Because this can apply in any genre. Murder mystery, you've probably never been a homicide detective. Just guessing. Based on your guys' age, I'm going to say probably never solved a murder. But you might want to write about that, right? Or you might want to write about two characters falling in love, but you've never been in love before. Or you might want to write about two characters who are of a different race or ethnicity than you. As a result of that, those are all things you have never experienced, but that doesn't mean you can't write about them. So, first thing that we're going to talk about is the do's and don'ts of comparison. Because the best thing that you can do in order to make people feel familiar with it is to use comparison. Now, what do I mean when I say comparison? I mean, you pair the familiar with the strange. So you take something that is familiar, like for example, riding on the back of the dragon, you could probably say riding on the back of a dragon is similar to riding a roller coaster, right? Because you have the wind rushing past your face, you have all this adrenaline, you feel like you're barely holding on for dear life, even though you're safely strapped in most of the time. But that's a good comparison because it's something people can relate to, right? It's something that people can go, oh, I'm familiar with this, I can figure this out from here. Now, you can just give a whole big, long description of exactly what you think it's like, and that's great too. However, comparison does help the reader to kind of see where you're coming from and kind of ground themselves a little bit. Now, the only problem with comparing to the familiar with the strange, the only things I would say not to do are these two things. If you are doing fantasy, the best thing you can do is to avoid pop culture references. Now, what do I mean when I say pop culture? Just because not everyone knows. This means, like, don't compare the excitement of seeing a fairy to going to a particular boy band that may not even be known in the next 3 years. Probably not a good comparison just because of the fact that some people may not know that boy band, and so, or they may not even like it, and so they're like, oh, it's really that exciting? They may not like it, or they may not know the pop culture reference. The one problem with pop culture references is that they do go out of style and they do go out of date over time. So if you're writing something, a good example of this is like the series Stranger Things, which you guys probably haven't seen because it's very scary. But it's a good example because it's written to be taking place in the 80s. So having a bunch of 80s pop culture references was perfectly acceptable because it is taking place in the 80s. However, if you're trying to imply that this is taking place during the present, and then you have things like pop culture references, it is immediately going to date your novel, and the older it gets, the less people will want to read it because they can't relate to it. So pop culture references are perfectly fine so long as you're writing a contemporary novel that is taking place in a certain time period, or if you're going back in time and you're writing a historical fiction. However, when it comes to fantasy, generally probably want to avoid pop culture references. So, the other thing that you're probably going to want to avoid is Earth to fantasy comparisons. Now, what do I mean when I say Earth to fantasy? Well, you're living in a fantasy world and you've never known anything else and your main characters only ever lived in this fantasy world. They probably aren't going to say, this food tastes an awful lot like bananas. Because bananas don't exist in their world. Because it's different universe. And so as a result, that's the one place when comparison gets a little hard. It is a lot easier when it's things like, for example, Harry Potter. They're in the earth, they're on the earth, they're just doing a fantasy thing. Now that's acceptable. You can do earth to fantasy references so long as they have come from or know about earth and regular humans. However, if they are a fairy who has lived in a fairy realm their entire life and knows nothing about humans and earth, they probably aren't going to make a whole lot of earth comparisons. So it's just something to consider. And last but not least, make sure if you're doing something unfamiliar that you ask people who are familiar with it. So for example, if you're writing about someone who has anxiety and you don't have anxiety, but your character has chronic panic attacks, they have serious anxiety, you're probably going to want to talk to someone who actually has chronic panic attacks and serious anxiety, because of the fact that you've never experienced that. So you might know what you think it's like, but this is where unfortunately toxic stereotypes come into play, especially with mental health writing. That's why so few people do it, which is sad because we need more of it in literature, but we also can't do as much without messing it up. Yeah, it's complicated. So if you're unfamiliar with something, make sure that you ask someone who is familiar with that. Or, for example, if you're writing a mystery novel and the mystery novel involves forensic science, do a little study about forensic science and what is possible and isn't possible for your mystery. For example, a lot of people have a misconception that hair is actually a great way to get DNA. It's not. That is something that they put in the shows, and they don't explain the fact that hair actually doesn't have a whole lot of DNA. What has DNA is the skin fiber attached to the hair, if there is one. So it's this long stretch at best. That's why sometimes you'll see they find a piece of hair and they're like, we have DNA, and then later they're like, the DNA was nothing, it didn't mean anything. The reason why is because there probably wasn't a skin fiber attached to that hair. The likelihood that there's a skin fiber is possible, but unfortunately it's about 50-50. So that evidence could mean nothing or it could mean everything. So you just got to do a little bit of research if you're unfamiliar with it. And if you're unfamiliar, that's okay. The reason we write is because we want to be able to experience things we're unfamiliar with, right? The only problem is when you start making up stuff that you know nothing about. And that's perfectly acceptable if you're doing fantasy. But if you're trying to do some form of realistic fiction, like murder mystery, contemporary romance, it's important that you talk to people who have actually gone through that. For example, with romance, it's also important that you talk to people who have been actually in love before, if you've never fallen in love. That's important to talk about because you've never experienced that, so you might try to write it in a way that isn't very realistic. And that's okay, it happens, but it does mean that you're going to have a lot harder time getting readers to enjoy it if they don't relate to it. Now, everyone has their own story, so that's perfectly acceptable. If you have your own stuff and you're like, well, my story is totally different from other people. For example, the way that I met my husband was through church, but not everyone meets their husband through church, right? And so as a result of that, it might not be relatable to some people, but that's okay so long as you don't have certain markers of non-realism. For example, like the whole love at first sight thing. I think that personally, I'm more of a that's a fantasy concept. Just because even if you're like, oh man, they'd be a great person to be with. They seem like such a great person. I could totally date them. You're probably not thinking they're my forever companion forever and ever. And if you are, that's great, cool for you. But also, not a lot of people experience that, and that's why a lot of people kind of like poo-poo the whole Disney thing, which makes me a little sad because I grew up on Disney. But that's why a lot of people don't like the Disney true love at first sight idea, because not a lot of people experience that. A lot of people, it's more slow, it's more well-paced. You also need to realize that with various other experiences, no one's experience is going to be the same. So even if you talk to someone, you may still have people who are like, oh, that's unrealistic, and you're like, well, I did the research, I talked to some people, and they say otherwise. That's okay, because everyone experiences things differently, it's never going to be the exact same. That's why it's good to get multiple opinions if you can, but if you can't, that's also perfectly fine. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, aside from comparison and things like that, is experience. I think I spelled that right. Yep. So, for some reason when I'm writing on the board, I forget how to spell. With experience, like we just talked about, you may not have experienced different things. Or like with historical fiction, war. You probably, and I hope you never will, experience fighting and possibly getting injured or watching your friends die in a war. I hope that never happens to you. But you may want to write that, right? You may be like, in this fantasy realm, the dragons have taken over and they're all like breathing fire on everyone. So there's a giant war between the dragons and the humans. You might want to write that, right? But unfortunately, you've probably never experienced fighting a giant dragon or war. So now what? Like I said before, you want to talk to people who've experienced it or do research if it's realistic. If it's not realistic and it's fantasy, this is when you compare it to something that you do know. And surprisingly, even though I know it will never be the same, and I know that war is something very unique and very different from anything else on the planet, things like famine and magic and murder and love, these are all things that are different for everyone, and it's always going to be diverse. But you can still compare it to what you do know. This is where the comparison to the familiar comes in. You can compare it to your own familiar experience. It doesn't have to be like you write that down and say, it is like, I don't know, having a panic attack. And you've experienced that. I hope not, but if that's the case, I would say you don't have to necessarily write that down all the time. You can just use that experience to be like, okay, well, for example, with Harry Potter. Harry Potter is going to school with magic, right? So she was able to say, well, I've been to a boarding school before, so take boarding school. Now I'm going to add some elements that are unfamiliar, that are strange, that make it unique. And it's the same thing with writing about other people's experiences. Maybe you feel like going to school is like a big war because you've been bullied a lot or something like that. Then you know what it feels like to be the victim or to fight back against your adversary. That can help you know a little taste of what certain things are like. And as a result of that, you can take that experience and say, well, I know what it's like to be the victim of a fight, and it sucks. So as a result, I'm going to extrapolate times 100 and imagine what that would feel like on a massive scale with a dragon. That makes it so that you feel a lot more like connected to your writing in a way that other people will never be able to understand. And that's okay. For example, for me, I write a lot of fantasy, but I write a lot of gothic fantasy. And so as a result, I've never like been inside a haunted house. No, that would scare me too bad. But I have been scared before, where I'm at home alone and I'm sitting there and all of a sudden I hear a crash in the kitchen and it's just a pot falling. But for me, I'm like, I'm gonna get murdered, someone's in my house. So that's a genuine fear that I have. And so I can write about people being afraid of being attacked by a monster or things like that because of the fact that even if I haven't experienced being attacked by a monster, I have experienced minor panic in my life that has made it so I feel like, oh, this must be what it's like to be attacked by a monster in the middle of nowhere. That being said, there are certain things that, like I said, you just have to do some research, you just have to talk to some people, but that's okay. That's why we have so many resources out in the universe. And the best part that you can do is that you can get a whole bunch of biographies, and I know biographies aren't always fun, but you could read them about other people's experiences about different things, and that can help you to even further extrapolate what things might be like. Alright, so the next thing we're going to talk about is sense of smell. And going with that, taste. Because taste and smell actually really do go together. A lot of people are like, oh, well, technically they're different things. Yes, technically. On a technicality, they are different things. However, how many times have you gone into the kitchen or something like that and you smell whatever's cooking and you're like, oh my gosh, you're already like drooling a little bit, right? You're like, oh my gosh, that smells great. And the reason why is because your olfactory and your gustatory, or taste, are connected. And when they're connected, that means that they're going to be very similar things. That also means that you can use them in your comparisons. So for example, in war, you might smell different things, like if it's a dragon war, right? You might smell burning, a lot of burning, because dragon fire, you know? And as a result of that, you might have an ashen or charcoalish taste in your mouth, right? That helps you further immerse the reader in this situation that you've never experienced, because you're able to say, okay, well, when I smell something burnt, I also can taste or imagine a taste in my mouth like this. Or, for example, if you're like me and you have exercise-induced asthma, sometimes when I run too hard because I'm just either pushing myself too hard, or it was like school and I was like, I'm going to beat you in the mile run, shouldn't have done that, then you might have an irony taste in your mouth because of the fact that you ran so hard, your lungs are pumping so hard to try to keep up, that you feel almost this rush of blood to your mouth and you taste iron. There is no actual blood, but you can taste iron, or at least in my experience with having exercise-induced asthma. And so as a result, you can take experiences like that and say, oh, well, I may never have had blood in my mouth, but I have had that experience. And so I can say, hey, if like someone punched someone in the face in my murder mystery novel, I can say they tasted the iron metallic tang in their mouth, even though I've never actually had blood in my mouth, thank goodness. But I've experienced something similar, so I can kind of connect the two. With smell, it is very tricky because of the fact that when you're doing fantasy, there's oftentimes a lot of things you haven't smelled before, right? New foods or mythical creatures. You know, sometimes you'll walk into a stable and the mythical creatures, like, you know, they've been living there a while. You may have walked into a horse stable, though, before, and walking into that horse stable, you can connect the two and say, oh, well, a horse stable kind of smells like this. So what would a stable full of griffins? And you can kind of say, oh, I think it's kind of like this. That can help you connect that familiar thing to that unfamiliar thing. And then with taste, fantasy foods. This is the main trickiest part, in my opinion, is fantasy food. Because you're making up a food that doesn't exist, and in some cases, like I said earlier, if you've never tried the food, you also can, in some ways, not feel like it exists because you've never tried it. For example, for years and years and years, I always imagined what octopus tasted like, but it actually is very different than what I anticipated it would taste like when I actually tried it. But that doesn't mean I was entirely wrong. There were certain elements that were similar because I was able to look up, like, what is this similar to? With fantasy, though, or with not having experienced something you've tasted before, you can derive it from the familiar that you have tasted, but then how are you going to describe it, right? You have to compare it to something, but then how do you compare it if you're in a fantasy world where, for instance, bananas doesn't exist, but bananas is the best comparison you have. You're like, it's like a spicy banana. And people are like, what's a banana? You're like, oh, dear. So then what are you going to do? Well, if you want to say it's like a spicy banana, go eat a banana. I highly recommend this as a fun writing exercise even. Go eat a banana or eat whatever food it is, and then, like, try thinking, well, how would I describe this to someone who has never had this before? Just kind of sit there and try a whole bunch of different foods and be like, what if someone had never had lasagna? Take a bite and you're like, how do I describe this to someone? That will help you be able to describe foods that you've never tasted and be able to describe fantasy foods as a result, because unfortunately those are things we can never taste, which makes me a little sad. Because sometimes there are really fun fantasy foods that people come up with. But with that being said, taste and smell will always be connected, and so don't forget to connect them when you're doing your own descriptions. That would also be a fun thing to do, is to walk someplace and kind of be like, okay, what does this smell like? Because you may not know what a giant fancy unicorn smells like, but you know what horses smell like, right? And so you can kind of extrapolate, or you can say, hey, well, horse pastures smell awful, but unicorns are better than regular horses, so it smells great. And you can change it entirely if you don't want to even compare it to the familiar and say, well, you know what, unicorns are better than that, so even though most horse pastures smell awful, unicorn horse pastures smell like cinnamon. Like, it's just fantastic. You can do that. You can totally go left field and just say, whatever, it's my own world, because it is your world. Alright, next thing is touch. Now obviously you've never like had a ghost walk through you if you're writing a murder mystery with a ghost in it. Or you've probably never, touched the scales of a mermaid. But have you touched a fish? Some of you may have, some of you may not. If you haven't, I would highly recommend, if you're writing about mermaids, go touch a fish. That sounds weird, but just go touch a fish. Because then you know what fish scales feel like, and you can kind of say, okay, well, if this is what fish scales feel like, what would mermaid scales feel like? And you can kind of say, okay, this is different. Or you can again just use your imagination and say, well, fish scales are kind of silky smooth because there's so many tiny ones. But I imagine that mermaids have larger scales, so it might be rough and a little bit more coarse, like a pine cone or something like that. So it's going to be a different thing. Or also go touching a lizard. The only difference is that lizard scales and fish scales are used for different purposes, so they're going to feel different. But go pet something with scales if you are writing about mermaids. And then when it comes to ghosts, you may have never experienced being haunted, right? I luckily haven't. But maybe you have. With touch, a lot of people describe a very cold feeling or sensation, or describe, maybe the ghosts aren't cold. Maybe if they're a bad ghost, they're cold. If good ghosts, they're warm. You can kind of play around with these ideas. The only problem you're going to run into with all of these, we're going to talk more about it in a minute, but the one problem you're going to run into is that you may not remember how you described things. As a result, this is when a world-building journal comes into play. You're going to want to pull out a journal dedicated to just world-building stuff, or a document if you think that's easier to not lose it. And you're just going to want to write down all these things. If you're like, hey, this is a new food, you write down the food, you write down the description. That way, if you ever reference it later, you can be like, shoot, I don't remember. You can go back to your list. I highly recommend a world building list. Don't go too crazy and then be like, this is the description of every plant in the universe. Too far. Too far. But if you're like, hey, these are the 5 most important herbs in my thing, then you can say, yes, these are the descriptions for the taste of these 5 herbs. Keep it simple. Don't go too crazy, because otherwise you'll end up forever world building and never actually writing, which can definitely happen. It's called world builder's disease. A lot of writers have it. Nothing wrong with it. Just means that you love the world building and the writing part is hard. That's okay. It is hard. Yes. J.R.R. Tolkien basically only wrote The Lord of the Rings because of the fact that he's like, I did all this world building. Now I'm finally going to write something. He probably would have written a lot more had he just chilled a little bit. Agreed. And so you can get stuff done and still have world builder's disease, but you'll get a lot less done than if you just make a quick note and move on. And it's okay to build your world. People love a well-built world, but you want to make sure that doesn't completely overtake you. Now, do we have any questions so far before I move on to sight and sound? It can even be like, what do you think this smells like or tastes like? If you're like writing a murder mystery and someone died of poison. I don't know. Any particular thoughts on that?
Have you ever smelled lizard manure?
I have not. I have not smelled lizard manure. I can only imagine it's very similar to regular manure, but at the same time their diet's different. So it probably does smell distinctly different, doesn't it? Yeah. I would highly recommend, I agree, finding someone who has a pet lizard and hasn't cleaned the cage in a while and just give it a big whiff. Which sounds awful. But if that's what you're looking for, I would highly recommend it. Unfortunately, I think the one English teacher that I knew at the junior high who had a pet lizard no longer goes to the junior high, which makes me a little sad. But, cause she had a little bearded dragon and she'd let him run around the classroom. But yeah, lizard manure. I would imagine that because of the diet they primarily have of typically bugs. Typically it's not so much greens, although some lizards eat greens. Usually it's bugs. I would say it's going to be very similar to like a dead bug type smell. and I know that sounds weird, but I actually have experienced a dead bug smell, even though I haven't experienced lizard manure, because of the fact that I really like bugs, and so I actually raise them as pets. And so sometimes bugs then die, and then I smell their cage because I'm cleaning up the cage because they're dead. And with a dead bug smell, I would say it's very stale. It's very poignant though also, where you can immediately kind of smell the difference. It's almost got this intense musty earth smell to it, as if the earth just smacked you in the face. Which sounds weird, but that would be my description. However, probably best to find someone with actual lizard manure. Yes.
What, like, if like a character
Mhm.
in your book has like a talent, but that
Yes.
you never like or an activity they do, and like you've never like even like done it before, know anything about it, what would you recommend to like learn how to write about it?
Excellent question. So, are we talking about a basic talent like juggling, or are we talking about a fancy talent like Sherlock's ability to be like, he's the murderer?
Just like a sport or something.
Like a sport or something. Okay, so good example of that is like Quidditch in Harry Potter, right? Quidditch doesn't actually exist. Well, now it does. A bunch of nerds have come up with it, but I've always wanted to try it since then. But before then, Quidditch didn't exist, right? It's a sport that doesn't exist. Or in your case, it might be a sport that exists, but you've never tried before. I would say if it is a sport that exists, make sure you at least try it. Even just a little bit. You don't have to be good at it, but if you at least try it, then you won't be like, oh, this is how the ball feels when I kick it or smack it, depending on what sport it is. And you can also kind of like learn about the rules and different things like that. So if it's a real sport, I would say study based on watching the sport and then maybe even try it out for yourself. You don't have to be good at it, but if you've at least tried it, you can compare it to your own experience. If it's a sport like Quidditch that doesn't actually exist, that you've totally made up out of whole cloth, I would recommend comparing it to other sports. So for example, if you look at Quidditch real hard, it's basically just fancy soccer. If you stare at it real hard and squint until your head. It's soccer on broomsticks with multiple goals and a weird flying thing.
Multiple weird flying things.
Multiple weird flying things, that's fair. But the reason I say that is because of the fact that it does have a lot of similar rules to that. It has a lot of similar things, like the keeper is like absolutely a goalie and things like that. So she took real sports and kind of extrapolated from it. So if it's not a real sport, I would say take real sports and then say, okay, how do I make a fake sport out of this real sport? And people will be able to tell, and as a result, they'll be able to relate to it more because they can feel familiarity, even if you don't directly draw the comparison yourself. If it's one, like I said, that actually exists, definitely watch it on TV if they have it on TV, and try playing it for yourself. Unless you're afraid for your life because it sounds like some sort of blood sport or a crazy thing like that. In which case, don't try it. In which case, do not try it, just research. But that's generally my advice. What sport is it, out of curiosity? Or is that just an example?
I was just thinking of like what, like if I wanted to play
Mhm.
character,
Yeah.
to have like a sport.
Yeah, I would say that.
I don't know, like dance or something.
No, it's true. Then I would say absolutely try that. Make sure that you go out and try some dance yourself, learn some dance yourself, and then maybe even watch some ballroom competitions online, because they have ballroom competitions online, or even Dancing with the Stars is a ballroom dancing competition, right? And that gets surprisingly intense. And so I would say if that's something that you're going to do, definitely watch and participate. And you don't have to be great at it in order to write about it, but it helps you to be able to have that relatable experience. All right.
Oh, but you know the
What?
dangerous sport is
Yes.
when the boys' locker room gets into a rat tail war.
Oh gosh, I don't even know. I don't think I want to know. That sounds terrifying. All right. So, next is sight. So, how do you describe something that you've never seen? For example, aliens or unicorns. You've never seen a unicorn. You've never seen an alien, right? Or at least I hope so. If We need to talk. Anyway, so if you've never seen something, it can be hard to describe, right? This is where your wonderful, beautiful imagination comes into play, because you can compare it again to things that you have seen. So, for example, unicorns they may look a lot like horses, so you may watch a lot of horses or look at a lot of horse pictures. But the best part is that then you can say, and they glow like a firefly in the night, or something like that. You could be like, you can just add on things. One of my favorite things to do is to take creatures and also just squish them together. A lot of that has been done in mythology, but that doesn't mean there aren't ones that you can't make up. As a result, you can say, well, what if I took a lizard and I took a pony and I went and I made them one creature. Depending on how you squish it. I was gonna say, depending on how you squish it, it could also sound adorable or it could be not adorable. Depends on what parts you put where. But this is why imagination is so great, because you can do stuff like that, and especially if you're in a fantasy universe, you can say things like that. Now, the one thing I would say that you got to be careful of with sight in fantasy, you can't compare it to earthen-based things, and if you do, you got to make sure it makes sense in your universe. Now, what do I say when it makes sense? All the other factors kind of don't have to make sense. Sight has to make sense. Why? Because if you have a blue dog and there's nothing else that's blue in your universe, why is it blue?
Because it is.
No, you need it to be able to blend in, right? That's why dogs are brown and gray and white and normal colors. If you have blue grass, however, though, or a very special like blue mineral caves that they live in, that would be great. That would be so cool to have a blue dog. But you gotta make sure it makes sense within the universe that you have. Or, for example, if the creature lives down in the depths of the ocean, they probably are going to have a lot of qualities that are either bioluminescence or blobfish. Why do I say blobfish? Because blobfish actually don't look like blobfish when they're in the deep sea trenches. They look like that because they have been, unfortunately, brought up too quickly, and so as a result their bodies decompress and they go like a big balloon losing air. And so you're going to want to make sure you take those things into consideration when creating a creature. For example,
if I took a blobfish
Yes.
out slow enough, it would look.
theoretically it could look very different. If you
I
kept it in like a
understand.
pressurized tank and like took it out slowly, yeah. You could actually have it look different than a regular blobfish. Because they're deflated and sad by the time they come up. So yes, that's actually very true. And this is important to take into effect also when you're writing about particularly mythical creatures, but also things you haven't experienced before, because of the fact that you may not have experienced looking at a crime scene, right? The good old murder mystery where you're like, I'm staring at a dead body that has been bludgeoned in the head. You've probably never, hopefully never looked at
I've
a
seen
body that's been murdered.
CSI.
But see, yes, that's when you look at things like CSI and things like that. You watch some murder mysteries on TV. Be careful because some of them can get really gruesome and messed up. But if you watch some of the tamer ones, it can be really helpful. Why? Because then even if you've never experienced it, the people who are writing the show, who either have done their research or have experienced it, have given you kind of what it looks like, right? And sure, it's going to be entirely different being in person versus seeing it on TV, but it gives you a generalized idea. Place to start. Now, back to the sight and fantasy, because that's important. Make sure that whatever it looks like, it takes on similar characteristics to what happens on Earth. Why? Because then not only can we relate to it again, but then also it makes sense in our brains. We like things to make sense. We like which is funny because we're reading fantasy, but even in fantasy, people like things to make sense, because if their fantasy doesn't feel real, then why read it? The whole point of reading fantasy is to make it feel real, to immerse yourself in it and feel like, yes, this could actually exist. So if you start throwing things in there like, this lion is bright red with green stripes, and there's no reason for it, your reader's gonna immediately be like, I'm putting the book down, I don't know why you have a red and green lion. But if you say something like, well, the grass in this particular climate is red and green, and so it has to be red and green, so it's like a zebra with the black and white stripes, so it blends in. That makes sense. You can do that. But you gotta make sure you explain it before you just throw it in there for no reason, just because you want to. And I know that sounds lame because it's fantasy, so you should be able to throw whatever in there. But you want it to feel real because your readers want it to feel real. Unfortunately for you. Last thing that we're going to talk about is sound. Now, how do you describe a sound that you've never heard before? For example, siren song or fairy laughter or things like that. You could go the Disney route and be like, fairy laughter is like the tinkling of a bell. Personally, I felt like a little bit cheating. And I'm like, okay, alright. It's just a bell, okay? But with sound, you can make it as elaborate or not elaborate as you want. I recommend keeping it decently in the middle. You don't want it to be so elaborate that the reader's like, I don't even know what I'm reading. But you also don't want it to be so simple that it's like, fairy laughter is like the laugh of a bell. It's like the ring of a bell. It's like, okay, cool. However, if Disney needs something like, it's like the ring of the prettiest bell you've ever heard on the most perfect day of Christmas. That has a different feeling to it, right? It has like this nostalgic feeling that you feel right in here in your heart. But if you just say something basic, probably not going to give the same fantasy vibe. So if you're doing the fantasy vibe, make sure to throw things in there that feel a little bit more like elaborate and interesting. If you're doing more of a realistic fiction vibe, then make sure that if you've never heard of cannon fire before, go look up some YouTube videos of cannon fire. We live in a lucky age. Thank you for coming.
It's insanely loud.
It is insanely loud. But my point being that we live in a lucky age where you have YouTube access, which means that you can probably look most things up. Well, except for maybe like a woman dying of murder or something like that. You probably don't want to look at YouTube videos like that. Or, yeah, Aztec Death Whistle. Those things are super cool. These are all things that you can hear and experience through YouTube. And if you're doing something like that with sound, you want to make sure that if it's something unfamiliar, like siren song, you use familiar things to think about it. Like, what is siren song like to you? And you don't necessarily have to say, well, it's exactly these things. You
It's
can
different
compare
to everyone to
different to everyone. Oh yes, exactly. Or you can say it's you can go with a metaphor and say it's like the most nostalgic feeling you've ever felt in your heart or something like that. And then someone imagines their own sound to it. That can be a good way to get around sound because it's hard to get around sound, but you can get around it ultimately. I'm trying not to sneeze. So, overall, when it comes to different experiences and the 5 senses of things that you haven't experienced, the best thing that I would recommend is research and comparison to things that you have personally found in your own life to be familiar. Now, does anyone else have any questions about writing about things that you have never experienced or never will experience in the case of, unfortunately, fantasy? Running in the back of a broomstick sounds really fun. But unfortunately, it is fantasy. So, any particular questions about writing these types of things? Do you have a specific thing in your novel that you're writing about that you would like to ask about? How do you think I should write this thing? Dragons roar specifically? Oh man. I would say one of the coolest things that I learned, actually funnily enough, from Star Wars, the Clone Wars, in one of their episodes they have a dragon-like giant lizard creature. And one of the coolest things was when I looked at the bonus features, they just talked about, this is how we created the roar. We took this roar and we spliced it with a little bit of this roar, and we spliced it with a little bit of this roar, and so as a result it became its own unique sound. I would recommend something similar for writing, where you compare it to 2 different things that are distinctly different, but when blended together create a unique sound.
Elephant.
You could. It's like the blaring call of an elephant mixed with the defiant roar of a lion, or something like that. That
It's a
helps.
sick of a mouse.
Yep, you can also do that. It's like the most deafening, it's like a mouse turned on to volume million. Squeak! Or you can even do crazy things like Pokemon does and say this creature makes the sound Pikachu. It's called Pikachu. So, you can honestly do whatever you want. I think the only problem that I see as far as sound goes and doing things like the Pokemon thing is the fact that some people might not find it realistic, but it actually is realistic. The reason why? There are several creatures that we have named based on the sound they make. Legitimately. For example, there's a leaf bug called the katydid. And the reason it's called the katydid is because when it chirps at night, it sounds kind of like and so it sounds kind of like it's saying katydid. And we named it katydid. So the Pikachu thing isn't so far off. It's really not. Or like chickadees. The reason we call them chickadees is because to most people it sounds like when they do their little cry. So as a result, that's what we called it. So if anyone gives you a bad time for naming a creature after the sound it makes,
Too bad.
too bad. It's realistic. Believe it or not, that is actually realistic. So, that's what I would say with sound, is either mix sounds together or make up your own crazy sound and then just be like, that is the name of the creature and that is the sound that it makes. Boom, done. That also means it's easy to remember, because then you're like, oh crap, what sound does this thing make? I know, it's the name. Makes it much easier to remember. Granted, that's also probably why we as human beings. That being said, any other questions? Sight, sound, touch, smell, taste. I think I said them all. Yeah. That being said, don't put yourself in any sort of danger to try and understand certain people's experiences. For example, if you've never been in war, don't go run out and get into a war, please. Please don't.
Just don't join a war.
Yes, exactly. Do something like Dungeons and Dragons or LARPing or something safe. Safe, please.
Like fighting each other with sharpened metal items.
Oh gosh. Safe. Safety first,
That's
please.
what they did. So there were larvas who they found an actual dead body. And one
Oh
of
my
them
gosh.
tried to get the necromancy spell, which uses a lot of glitter, and then they contaminated the.
People are special. All right. Wow. All right. And then one other thing that I would recommend is make sure that you don't put yourself in any danger physically. For example, if your character is experiencing severe hunger because of the fact that they are starving to death, don't try and starve yourself to death.
Don't.
Please don't. I'm begging you. You might be able to be like, oh, I'm really hungry, and then times it by 1,000,000 in your head. But please do it in your head. Don't just be like, Mom, I'm not eating for the next week in order to experience famine. No, please do not. Please don't do that. So when I say compare it to your own experiences, I don't mean go out and experience it necessarily, unless it's safe to do so. But if you want to ask someone who's also been through that, that's also possible. Or if you want to do research on what people have been through as far as that goes, you can do that as well. There's a lot of biographies about things like that, unfortunately, terrible things. And as a result of that, if you're worried about being able to describe it right, you can always go and check out a biography or nonfiction, or like I said, take your own experience and try to extrapolate as far out as possible. All right, any other questions? About writing about things that you've not experienced personally, like alien abduction. I luckily have never been abducted by aliens.
That you know of.
Weird music playing.
So only the Men in Black run in. You're under arrest.
It's like, oh, I do.
And then they take you under arrest.
Oh,
and
man.
They're like,
That's
this,
wild.
and they're like, well, you don't remember this. Just the memory thing.
I like having things like that. I would say definitely if you're gonna do stuff like
things
aliens.
like that happening to you?
No, I just mean I like the idea of like having a reason why you don't remember it, because a lot of people are like, well, if there was aliens, we'd know, right?
And then in one
So that's part of the reason I like that idea so much. So as far as that goes, I would say if you're going to do something that's like in real life, this thing exists. For example, Harry Potter, you've got to explain why people don't know it exists. Is it in another realm? Do they have a bunch of magical spells cast on it to make it look like a big creepy forest and so no one goes in there? You know, have some sort of reason.
That makes me more tempted to go.
Because it's fantasy.
But-
you can do anything with fantasy.
So that's why I'm like, if you have it be on the planet Earth and you have some sort of like other thing, make sure you explain why other people have never experienced it or don't know that it
Is
exists.
there a good way to explain nuclear civil war in space?
Nuclear civil war in space. Wow, that is quite a specific description.
Look.
I would say look
Lot
up
of
a lot. I would say look up a lot of YouTube videos, unfortunately, of nuclear bomb testing and things like that. Just because then you'll know similarly to describe the sound, you'll be able to describe
There's
what
no
it looks
sound.
like.
There'll be no sound.
It's true because it is in space, unless they're on a planet. I was thinking like on a specific planet in space, but you're right. If they're actually in the
There is
void
sound
of
in
space,
but it's really quiet because there's not many air molecules.
It'll just be like, this is nuke going up.
just here's the sound. Little
then
puff
the-
there.
and then the-
Anyway, so that being said, I would say nuclear war in space. I would also say,
Okay,
since you
so-
said it was a civil war, I'd recommend doing lots of research on the actual American Civil War and other civil wars on other countries, because then you can know more of the politics. Unfortunately, civil war often does have to do a lot with politics. It's not often a lot of like hate and things like that. Some of it's hate, but a lot of it's also just politics. As a result, it would be important for you to research that to be able to more fully get in the mindset of someone who's in a civil war. Make sure that make sure that the other side isn't completely demonized. Just because of the fact that, like, for example, in the Civil War that we had in America, a lot of times we demonize the South and say, like, they're the worst because they were trying to defend the ability to have slaves. Well, you may not know, but a lot of the slavery type stuff had to do with their economy. And so it wasn't necessarily that everyone wanted slaves still. A lot of it, too, was the fact that they were like, oh, if we don't keep this, our whole economy is going to go under. Now, they obviously didn't think of other ways of fixing that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't a valid concern. Sure, should they put human life over their economy? Yes, but it's still a valid concern. And a lot of people fought on the South that didn't actually want to fight on the South. There were lots of people that were like, I actually personally believe all the slaves should be free. And they were like, well, too bad, you've been enlisted anyway, so you have to fight for us. So there's a lot more going on than just good and bad, especially in a civil war. So I'd recommend doing a lot of research into politics of that kind of stuff. It's kind of frustrating that we have actual experiences of that, but on the bright side, it means that now you can write a civil war better. So, any other questions of things and how you would describe them?
I just realized that I am from the South. Just here, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna hide over here. Don't hurt me.
No,
I come in peace.
I love people from the South. That's why I'm like, I think it's terrible to people that like those dang Southerners, and I'm like, why? They're also just people. They're people too. So like, yes,
They're
Southerners
not
are
just
great. I
soldiers.
have lots of people who grew up in the South who are my friends. Anyway, so that being said, I had a thought, now it's gone. Ran away. Oh, if you're doing stuff like secret agent FBI stuff, make sure that you do some actual research. Now, unfortunately, you can't find everything because a lot of the actual secret agent FBI stuff is so secret that if you discovered it, you'd be in trouble.
The Men
For
in
ex-
Black would come after you.
For example, there's a guy, I believe it's Tom Clancy, who wrote his novels about like military espionage so well that they literally like took him aside and were like, "How did you know about it?" And he's like, "I didn't. I imagined it." So he was just a really good imaginative mind and was like, "Well, theoretically, this could be a thing." And they were like, "It's actually a thing." And he's like, "Oh, what?" So sometimes your imagination can get you in trouble, but don't let that stop you.
So you're saying this get in trouble, got it.
No, not necessarily. Anyway, but my point is that you can write things realistically even if you have no experience. He had absolutely no experience, but he was able to write it realistically because he was able to take other people's experiences and his own knowledge and squish it together, and it made sense.
And
So if you're doing things like that, just make sure it also makes logical sense. For example, if you're having the character get kidnapped, don't have it be in a busy cafe full of like 90 people.
Actually, that would be the best place because it's so crowded no one would notice. As compared to if there were 5 people, then all those 5 people would notice you kidnapping.
Yes and no. I would say at least guaranteed someone's gonna notice, even if it's busy.
Someone will just like that one person that noticed you and just like, well, he's okay.
He's okay.
It's gonna be fine.
See, this is why you make sure that you have an excuse for it. For example, if they like chloroform them have them be like, yeah, he had one too many drinks, you know, he way drunk. That would make sense. Then you can have people be like, oh sure, whatever. But if you're doing it in a busy restaurant and all of a sudden out of nowhere someone's like, come with me, and they're like, no, I don't want to go, and they're screaming, and then yet no, all of the 90 people just continue to just eat their lunch while this person's like, no, don't take me. That's not realistic.
Unless it's a child, then they might think, well, that's just a brat child.
True, but if you're a full-grown adult, you're like, this is concerned.
Well, that's just a brat adult then.
Oh my gosh.
Alan,
Anyway,
just
so
have it be at a bar. Then the person could,
Yes,
the
exactly.
kidnapper could declare a bar fight and
there you
knock
go.
them out.
Then
and
knock
then
them out
drag
during the
them
bar
out.
fight. There you go. See, this is why I'm like, you gotta come up with a reason for these things to function properly. You also gotta make sure that you don't contradict yourself. For example, if you have said person get kidnapped from this place, and then you later be like, this place is too secret, this place is too obvious, so we need to talk somewhere in secret. And it's like, well, it was plenty secret enough for you to kidnap them, so I think you can talk about it. It's important to not contradict yourself as well. If you're writing about things that you don't know much about, make sure that you don't contradict the thing that you already said if you're making up stuff. So, the only reason I mention that is because lots of people contradict themselves on accident in novels and then have to have it fixed.
I
Yes.
have a quick question about kidnapping and then being knocked out.
Okay, kidnapping and knocking people out. Got it. This got on a very weird tangent, but we're talking about things that you've never experienced, and luckily none of you have ever been kidnapped, as far as I'm aware. Good job.
That you're aware.
That's why I said, as far as I'm aware. Should I be concerned?
Okay, I'm just curious. If you're writing the story in first person and
Yes.
that person is getting kidnapped and gets knocked out, could you technically at that time have a memory appear while they're knocked out? Are you allowed to do that?
Define memory appear.
Just like a major memory that has traumatized the main character.
You mean like PTSD or like amnesia comes back to them? Like,
You know, like when they've been kidnapped, they've been
Yes.
knocked out.
Mhm.
They're technically like asleep right now.
Yes.
While they're knocked out,
Mhm.
they have a memory. Like sometimes when you sleep, you sometimes relive a memory.
ah, that's what you're talking about.
That's
Okay.
what I'm saying.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm
It
just
dep-
gonna get my
That's
characterization
okay.
now.
It depends on the kind of knocked out. The reason I say that is because, for instance, I have fainted twice in my life, been fully unconscious, and I didn't know I was even unconscious until I woke up in the nurse's office. So it depends on what type of unconscious it is. Sometimes you just full on black out, and the next thing you know, you're like, why am I in the nurse's office? And they're like, you freaking passed out, and you're like, oh.
Oh, yeah.
So I would recommend you make sure that you look up different kinds of passing out, which sounds weird, but it is a thing. Because, for instance, fainting, most people don't have any sort of visions during being fainting. Most of the time, it's like bright flash of white if you're like hitting someone and they faint, or if you're like knocking them out, or if you're just having them faint, like they're like, oh no, someone died. Then they probably are just gonna black out and not even remember until they wake up. However, if you're doing something like chloroform, I've never actually researched what chloroform
I'm not
is.
just. I'm talking about a distant memory, like.
No,
this
yeah.
is just a random example.
I totally
like
get
when
that.
you're
I
4.
totally get that. I do. I'm just saying that not all ways of being knocked out are going to induce memories, like in sleep. Some of them actually are anti-memory, like with fainting. there's never been a time that anyone I know has fainted and had a memory. So it's just about the type that you're talking about. You could even make it, because you have a fantasy novel, right? You could even make it that it's a specific type of herb that causes like them to be unconscious, but in that semi-unconscious state, they're kind of like a hallucinogenic drug. And so as a result, they kind of are like, what? And they kind of have this memory in the back of their head come forward. That's possible, for sure. But you gotta make sure that you do research about what doesn't have memories and what does as far as being unconscious, because the unconscious mind is a fickle thing. And sometimes it can generate memories when you're asleep, and other times you fully just have no idea what just happened.
Another question about
Yes.
another question about that is, could I technically have the character have a memory, and then when they wake up, they immediately forget?
Theoretically, yes. The only thing is it would need to move the plot forward, in my opinion. Generally, I don't like doing memory flashbacks unless it does one of two things. It establishes more character and helps the character be more likable, or it moves the plot forward. If it doesn't do either of those two things, then there's no reason to have it.
Could I have it to explain a character's backstory per se? Like-
Yes, I would say that is a valid reason. The only reason I mentioned it is just because there are times when people are like, here's a cool memory from their life, and I'm like, that has no purpose being here. But if it like describes their backstory or something like that, I would say that absolutely is a valid thing, for sure.
Or what if it doesn't explain, but my main character, her parents
Yes,
died.
I remember that.
I'm sorry,
The moment
So-
when you're just sobbing over your characters, yes.
So anyway,
yeah, bright light,
would it
never
be
mind.
okay if I had memory of her with her parents, like when
then
she's
her-
younger? Would that technically be relevant? And then she wakes up like semi-crying.
Yeah, I would say that definitely would be relevant, especially if it's like an important memory. You don't want it to just be a random memory of them like sitting around the table eating for no reason.
Yeah, it's like,
But it's like great. But if it's like an important memory, like they're saying "I love you so much" or something like that, and then she wakes up and she's all like, "No,"
And then the
yeah,
guard's
then
like,
that
"Stop crying."
absolutely, yeah, or something like that. Absolutely, I would say that's perfectly
I just
valid.
realized that I'm going to have what am I doing to my character?
Honestly, most of the time we do a lot of bad things to our character, but we do them for
Because
the
we
right
love
plot reasons.
So that they're not just so they don't have plot armor.
Yeah, unfortunately, our characters can't have super huge amounts of plot armor. They have to get injured and have problems.
Their father got injured.
Exactly. So you gotta make sure that they feel real. They don't feel real if you're just like, and they have nothing go wrong all the time. It's
They're
like,
just completely.
that's not relatable to anyone, because everyone's like, you know what, my life, sometimes I have a great week. Sometimes it's the best week ever. But most of the time there's at least one thing that goes wrong. Whether it's I slept past my alarm, or the food I made too salty.
Or I fell off the building but survived.
Concern.
I
Yeah.
broke a finger but I'm
But
fine.
I'm fine. See, there's going to be things that are going to cause minor inconveniences in your life, and so having, and even major inconveniences. A lot of people, the reason they like watching war flicks is because they can relate to it if they have some sort of major trauma happen in their life, because they're like, yeah, this is what life is, major trauma. And they can relate to that because of the fact that they've gone through said major trauma. Or like with romances, where people are like, I wish I had a lover, and so they watch it, and then they cry when they're like, no, but you had to get together, don't leave to Paris, or whatever. You gotta make sure that you have a little drama, have a little intrigue, because your story, whether or not if you've ever experienced anything like this, should be like a heartbeat, right? There's highs and there's lows in a heartbeat. It's not constantly high, 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 high. If it is, you are in adrenaline shock, and I'm concerned for you. And it shouldn't be permanently low, because that means you're probably in a coma. So,
Or you're just very special, or you just don't move.
or you
Never
just don't
moving.
move. You're a carrot. So, that being said, you want to make sure that your plot and your character's emotions are similar. You don't want to have it be permanently high, but you also don't want to have it be like the worst thing that ever happens to them is they trip and they break their nose and they're sad.
How did you break their nose?
Well, you trip
The
and you
worst
fall on your
thing my
face.
But
character
usually you
well,
catch yourself.
Usually, but that doesn't mean you can. Like if you're holding an armful of books or something, just wait.
The books will catch your fall.
The second worst thing that I'm gonna have my character do is he's gonna jump out of a burning building that's about to blow
pretty
up.
But why?
That's the
Because it's
second
about to
worst.
blow up.
And he breaks.
We missed that part.
He breaks his he breaks his left arm in 4 places.
Dang. But yeah, so as far as that goes, you want to make sure that when you're doing experiences, you have little experiences that are cool. For example, in Harry Potter, little experiences like pumpkin juice and butterbeer. Yay! Tiny little fun experiences. But you also have big experiences like fighting Voldemort. So that, as a result, you're having like this is finding out about Voldemort. This is like pumpkin juice and butterbeer. And this is fighting Voldemort again, and more like fun spell classes and fighting Voldemort again. And
And
then
then that last one was
How many times does Harry Potter
Kill-
fight Voldemort?
Exactly so many times.
So many times that.
Practically every book.
He's basically, he is an
In the third one, he doesn't fight Voldemort.
In which one?
The third.
That's true. That is true. He doesn't fight Voldemort in that one. You are correct. But anyway, almost every book, I suppose. But the point being that when you're talking about experiences, you got to make sure you have little fun experiences as well as big fun experiences. That will also help your world to feel more tangible. All right. Any final questions before I turn the video off and we go to editing/free write?
How should I kill my character?
Oh my gosh. I don't think that's an experience related thing. That's more an opinion based question. Depends. I would say the best rules for killing off characters, which sounds really bad. But there
It's
are
just
rules.
how much you hate them.
Not necessarily. And so, with killing off characters, if it's the villain, you want to make sure it's earned. Why? Because otherwise it feels like it's cheating. If Harry Potter in the very first book was like, die, Voldemort! And he died, we'd all be like, oh.
How?
Exactly, we'd also be like, how, what,
He
why?
learned about Avada Kedavra in the book.
Exactly.
Explain
Immediately.
the knowledge.
He's like, I want to test the spell out. Avada Kedavra?
But then you'd still feel a little cheated, right?
He
You'd be
tests
like, oh,
it out
okay.
on Ron. Avada Kedavra.
At this point, I think Harry Potter's now become a serial killer in this particular version. Alright, so.
If I killed Neville, I would be so angry.
He's just like,
So-
oh, better test this on me.
So with writing and things like that, if you're killing off a villain, you want to make sure it's earned. You want to make sure that the final battle is epic and cool, and it's not just like the villain running away in terror, because then you're just sad. So
I want to kill off.
there's a particular novel that does it, and it made me sad because I
Okay.
loved the whole series, and I was like, yes, final battle, final battle. Final battle was 10 seconds long, and the villain was going Wah! The whole time. I'm like, that was disappointing. All right. So
I just wanted something I could do that, and then the character's like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be all powerful. I know, but I'm a coward.
but I'm a coward. So exactly, I'm like. So in that case, I would say if it's a villain, make sure that it is earned and that the
Main
final battle is
character.
awesome. You gotta make sure it's worth something. If you're gonna kill a main character,
Don't kill the
you can't have them have a meaningless death.
He's just
Meaningless
gonna
death.
trip
He
and
tripped
accidentally fall
on a
in it.
butterfly.
So the reason he cannot have a meaningless death is because of the fact that he's the main character. If he was some random side character that had no purpose, that's totally fine if you want to have them comedically die. That's the reason why in Star Wars and Star Trek you have random clone troopers that are like, "Hurrah!" and dying everywhere. Why? Because of the fact that it makes it comedic, but also easy to kill off people and be like, see, people die, while still not killing the main
And
character.
they're useless.
And they're a little useless. Funnily enough, the clones
Yeah, they
actually
don't
weren't
do it to
useless. The
stormtroopers.
stormtroopers were, which makes me really confused. Anyway, so
Troopers were better than
the clone troopers were so much better. They were like kick-butt awesome people. And
Captain
stormtroopers.
But they have horrible
Anyway,
names.
so funnily enough, clone troopers don't. Stormtroopers do.
Oh,
Just
I
have
thought we were,
001.
no, I was talking about the
Oh,
stormtroopers
gotcha,
having
yes.
horrible names.
Yes.
001, 002, 003.
Anyway, so that being said, if you're gonna kill off your main character, make sure that it's worth something. Make sure that as they're dying, something happens that that's the only way they can accomplish their goal is through death.
They fall on, they trip onto the axe, and then the axe flies into the villain and meets them.
That would only be if it's a comedy. If you're doing doing a serious novel, probably don't want to do that. But if
It's
you're
gonna
doing
be
a comedy,
serious. I'm gonna make my audience cry and hate me so much.
So-
I'm gonna look out the window.
so I would say if you're doing the falling on the axe thing, it's got to be a comedy. I'm sorry, that's too comedic to do it for a serious novel. But if you're doing
But
a
it's
serious thing,
people trip over axes all the time.
I
They don't
know,
wear the
but
right
how?
pants.
But we're in a fantasy.
How
We don't
often,
want
though?
people to comedically trip over an axe unless when it's serious. We want it to be a serious battle. It's like I talked about with the villain. You want to make sure it's earned. So that's my recommendation with main character deaths is it has to feel earned. If it doesn't feel earned, then the readers are just depressed and sad, and they're like, oh, he died for no reason. Whereas if he died, and because he died, the villain was able to be thwarted and stopped, that's great.
Necromancy. Then.
He died
So-
because the villain
Like with
became
Harry
a
Potter,
safe
except for he
person.
didn't.
For example, there was actually a TV series that I was watching, and I loved most of the TV series. And then at the last moment, they had this character that was like, if you kill me, then you can kill the bad guy easier because of the fact that I have this connection to him. And so if you kill me, then he won't gain as much power because he's gaining power through my abilities. And they killed him, and I was like, great, now they're gonna go kill the bad guy and everything's gonna be great. No, his death was perfectly meaningless. I was pissed. I was so angry. I was like, you killed him, and the bad guy still almost won. That is not acceptable. He had no reason to die then. You shouldn't have killed him. And guess what? There's a reason it's for free because everyone hates it. Because of that, you have to have your characters' deaths mean something if they are valuable to the plot at all.
I was gonna say,
Question about
they
villain
have
death.
little tiny guns that barely do any damage, and when the main character dies, he turns into a rocket launcher. So they're just like,
Wow. What? This really does sound like a comedy. Anyway, so
So
villain
this
death.
is about a villain.
Yes.
death. So I don't know if I'm going to do it, but what if I create a villain
Yes.
that works because I basically have this main villain and
Yeah.
other like side villains that are kind of important. I'm thinking of making a villain that works for this villain, but ain't that powerful and has the weirdest meaningless death. Am I allowed to just do that randomly?
I think that is okay if it is a kid's book, only because of the fact that some people get away with that. For example, once again, Pokemon. If you guys have ever seen the actual, if you've ever actually seen the actual Pokemon show, Team Rocket is the lamest villains ever.
Don't go into Giovanni.
But the reason why it works is because it's a kids show, and so the kids get a laugh, and they're like, heh heh, they got thwarted again. And so,
500
but if you-
episodes later.
exactly. But if you're doing a YA novel, they're not going to accept that as much because they're like, well, real villains aren't that dumb. There actually are some that aren't that dumb. But they
No, I
won't.
want to make a dumb villain.
People won't like it as much because they don't feel like it's realistic, which is funny because it is realistic. There's actually like a TV show called basically Dumb Crimes because there
There's
are
also
people
a
who
book
are
about
dumb and
that.
try to commit
There's-
crime.
There's also multiple books about that.
Exactly. Where it's just people who are dumb. So
Like, for
they
example,
exist.
Going into a robbery with your face covered, except for
Yep.
you forgot to cut eye holes. So if you do this, they're gonna see your face.
Exactly.
Or if
exactly.
you try to pretend to have a gun in your pocket and then you pull out your hand, it's like it's still a gun.
It's still a gun, clearly. Hands in the air, yeah, no. Or, yeah, it's just, people are special. But that does not necessarily mean that your villains have to be that way, especially, it depends on the grade. If you're doing for little kids, they will absolutely love that. The kids will be like, hey, hey. But if you're doing it for adults, or YA, I would say maybe one dumb character, but then I would say if you're going to do the dumb character, make sure that it's obvious that they're dumb from the start and that they're just a henchman. You got to make sure that they're not ever thinking they're smart and then suddenly they're dumb and you're like, why? That doesn't make sense. You got to make sure they're dumb from the very
Or
start.
you
It
can
would
make the
make
leader
sense
dumb
for
and the leader thinks he's
immature
smart and the henchmen are smart
The henchmen are smart.
and they think they're dumb.
No,
Like,
it could be possible.
Yeah.
Once again, I feel like that would be more comedy.
Yes. Strong
I just had the funniest thought to immediately for a reader to immediately tell that this villain is dumb. As they're walking by, the villain is licking a pole.
It's like, great.
Ooh, lollipop.
It's like concern. But yeah, so If you're gonna have the dumb henchmen, just make sure that they're not too dumb. If you're doing a young adult novel, if you're doing a junior fiction novel, though, it's a little more acceptable, but not. It depends on the age range for the junior fiction.
It just needs to be for immature adults.
This is a book.
Or
for
just
only
comedy, just
adults.
immature adults comedy. Yes, that's fair. Okay, I'm gonna stop the video now, but you can still ask more questions after we finish the video. We just seem to have finally veered off topic.
I
So,
thought we did that a long time ago.
this is true. By the way, in November we will be having a first chapter writing contest. The word limit for it will be 3,000 words. And with that being said, make sure that you follow all the directions. If it is not in the proper font size, etc., I will not be able to take it. So please just know that that will be happening in November. I will not be passing out like entry forms until October. So it's going to be a while, but I figured I'd give you guys a heads up.